So this is a great pleasure for me to have Frederic Stout joining us, Gayle Rubin on my far left, and myself, John Mollenkopf. Fred and I started teaching together almost 40 years ago in the Stanford Urban Studies program, and it was a great education for me to be able to work with Fred. So it's also a pleasure to have him joining us today. This is going to be a symphony in 3 acts. We're going to basically give you a very short course in urban studies in 30 minutes. So a very rapid overview. And not to use up any of our precious minutes, we'll start right in with Fred.
Great, thanks very much, John. Teaching with you was a great education as well. So if the first question is why study cities, I would say, from a personal point of view, that I was inspired to study cities by Lewis Mumford, who had a theory called the urban drama. And the idea being, he elaborated this throughout his life really, but in a speech he gave to a bunch of planners in 1937, he said, look, economic development is very important, transportation is very important, urban amenities, parks, so on and so forth, all those things are very important, but the essential factor of cities is that it's where the urban drama is played out, which is the human drama. It is the drama between people, it's struggles, it's learning, it's interacting. It's all of those things that goes together to make human life what it is. And so in this sense, living in cities, according to Mumford, was the human project. I'm also been influenced by the notion that Frederic Olmsted first enunciated. He called it the urban drift when he was speaking to a bunch of civic leaders in Boston in 1870. He said, we need to build parks because humanity is on an urban drift. We're becoming more and more urban over time. Well, that was in 1870, and what he was talking about, of course, is what we would call today the urbanization process. And the urbanization process has recently, it started in Europe, and I'll tell you in a minute. It started in Europe and in North America. These were the places where urban civilization really first took hold. But in recent years, there's been a dramatic new increase, particularly in Asia, also in Latin America to a somewhat lesser extent. Africa still lags a little bit behind, but the urbanization process has become an extraordinary explosion in recent years. And this is all the more reason then to study, give me the next slide. There it is, to study cities today. This is the famous, most of you have probably seen this, the chart showing the explosion of urbanization that began, this is the world urbanization that began in around 1800, that since, for the 5,000 years that cities have been around, urbanization had always been sort of under 10%, but then in about 1800, with the Industrial Revolution, a huge uptick in the process of urbanization. And we know that according to the United Nations, I think it was in 2011, that the world population became 50% urban. Interestingly, actually I think that was in 2009. In 2011, last year, China became 50% urban. And we used to look at this chart and have nice academic discussions and say, well, where do you think this chart is going to go in the future? Is it going to go up to 100%? Might it just level off at 50% and stay there? Or might it drop? Might we look back 1,000 years from now and say, what was that stuff about the cities all about, There would seem to be a big, peak there that has gone away. And some people who believe that computers and telecommunications would eradicate distance often put forward that kind of argument. Interesting, plausible argument. But I think we now realize that, in fact, the world population is likely to go up into the area of 80% urban, probably by the end of this century. And most projections have this in mind because of the facts around urbanization, when you look at the developed world. The United Kingdom became 50% urban around 1890. It wasn't until the 1920 census in the United States that it became obvious or became revealed that 50% of the American population had become urban. Well, today, 80% of Great Britain is urban, and in the United States, it's now 83%. So that academic discussion of might it level off, might it go down, seems probably not the case. And what's driven this in an important way has been countries in Asia, particularly China. If you look at the population of China in 1950, 12% urban. And as I say, last year it hit 50%. As late as 1975, I think the urban population of China was about 17%. So it's gone just in a couple of decades, from 17% to 50%. This is a dramatic increase. And so you look at this and you say the world is becoming urban to an extraordinary degree. This isn't just the human project. This is humanity's fate. This is humanity's destiny. And we better start thinking about it seriously if we're going to get it right. Now, what drives urbanization? What drives urbanization is in-migration from rural districts. Rural to urban shifts. It isn't that the birth rate in cities is higher. In fact, quite the opposite. The birth rate in cities is much lower than it is in the rural districts for a variety of cultural and economic reasons. But people are coming to the city from rural districts all the time. And when you look at a case like China, you're talking about one of the great historic migrations of people internal to China that is similar to, in scope certainly, to what happened in the United States in the 19th century, early 20th century, with migration coming from overseas. So one of the points of this, then, is that if urbanization, which is really exploding right now, is growing by people migrating here into the cities from rural districts, then over and over again what we are going to encounter in studying the city are newcomers to the city. And how newcomers become urban, how they form communities, how they advance is terribly important to understand. And although a lot of the literature of cities has been very negative, we tended to learn a great deal about the poverty of cities, crime rates in cities, the pollution caused by cities, so on and so forth. Let me just make note of the fact that in the last year or two, there's been a spate, more than just a couple, a spate, I tell you, of interesting books that have come out that have given us a new cast on this entire problem. One of them is Edward Glazes' Triumph of the City, a very provocative book. He talks about humanity being the urban species. He talks about cities that will end the population crisis, since since urban populations have fewer children. That may be the case, unfortunately, of course. Well, not unfortunately, but going against that is the fact that life expectancy is much higher with urban civilization, so that the urban population issue will still remain. But cities are also the greenest way to live, according to Glazer. And most provocatively, he says that cities don't create poor people. Poor people are attracted to cities, looking for opportunity, and often, over and over again, finding it. And that includes the people in the para-slums that surround many of the major global cities. Now, a number of those ideas come from other sources. David Owen, a while ago, wrote a wonderful book called Green Metropolis. This was published, I think, in 2009, 2010. Green Metropolis, in which he says that cities of the density of Manhattan are per capita the greenest way for people to live. And he has wonderful facts backing all that up, and it's extraordinarily revelatory. He talks about his wife and himself moving to a community where they would have a low carbon footprint, they would walk for all of their shopping, take mass transit for any kind of longer trips, and the name of this utopian community was Manhattan. And so in addition to that, Doug Saunders wrote a wonderful book called Arrival City, which talks about cities that were the places where poor people and different communities of people from rural districts come in order to find opportunity. And he makes the final point that is very important to this entire discussion. Just because there are these good effects from urbanization, we can't take the Pollyanna attitude. There are successful arrival cities, and there are arrival cities that are failures, according to Saunders. And this would warn us that just because there's tremendous potential and possibilities here, we need to be very careful about what policies are put into place. We don't want to ruin the possibilities.
My name is John Mollenkopf. I teach political science and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and direct its Center for Urban Research. And this slide is one of Fred's favorites, so thanks for lending it to me. I want to talk a little bit about how people think about cities, how they study cities. And the first point to be made about the slide, I think, is that urban studies, to me at least, is inherently interdisciplinary. And that's one of its beauties, one of its fascinations about studying it. You can think about cities as having a variety of functions, but this slide depicts three of them. First, they house authoritative political, legal, religious, and cultural institutions, here dubbed the Citadel, but including law courts, military barracks, cathedral, university, and museums, and so forth, along with governmental functions. Second, they house key markets for all sorts of things, whether it's stocks, commodities, real estate, wholesale goods, retail goods. And finally, they're made up of neighborhoods of people, of cultures and subcultures, with dense residential neighborhood clusters which foster group interaction in public spaces, small worlds, and as various kinds of subcultures, as I say. In a way, though, we should add a fourth dimension to this diagram, which is that cities are nodes in networks. They can't be studied just within themselves, but have to be thought of in relationship with the kinds of transactions that they tend to maximize, and those transactions take place over great distances, and they can involve ideas, they can involve goods and services, they can involve flows of people, and so on. So in some sense, this triad needs to be embedded in a larger matrix of interaction among cities. So we need to think about cities as parts of metropolitan regions for sure, and also parts of larger cross-national city systems of various kinds. Well, these main ways of thinking about city functions have generated at least three principal ways of analyzing cities. If we start at the top with the authoritative institutions, one intellectual strand of historical institutionalism has developed to explain how the initial location advantages of a given city can enable within it institutions and industry concentrations to be created that then give it an ongoing competitive advantage of one sort or another. And this is political as well as economic. Cities have been the cradle of democracy from the revolt of the Netherlands in the 1500s through our own national revolution in the end of the 18th century. Urban economics, and Glazes' book is, as Fred has mentioned, is one of the most interesting recent offerings in that area. Urban economists have looked carefully at how agglomeration economies and diseconomies stimulate innovation and productivity and create economic locational advantages for cities and within metropolitan regions. But I'd like to focus the remainder of my remarks on the third circle, the rise of different populations within an urban area and an urban ecology. And the most prominent strand of analysis developing from this way of thinking about cities has been the Chicago School of Sociology, which, by the way, also there was a closely related but much less discussed Chicago School of Urban Politics. Park and Burgess, with the founding of the University of Chicago, bringing European ideas together with ideas that were developing in biology at the time, inspired many later generations of people who think about human ecology, but also political scientists like Charles Merriam and later V.O. Key. And the basic idea in the Chicago School is that density creates complexity, a kind of division of labor, not just in economics, but in all other spheres of social life. And complexity, a key facet of complexity is heterogeneity. Lots of different kinds of groups that are interacting in a very dense, confined space. And this interaction leads to competition and even conflict among the constituent groups of the urban area. As these groups are constantly changing, as older groups age and perhaps lose power, or at least lose demographic prominence, and new groups are coming into the system. So the city is all about intergroup competition and intergroup succession. It's a key factor of urban life. But the competition is not just in an open market, in a sense, but groups mobilize themselves to form dominant coalitions, to achieve dominant positions in whatever institution we're talking about, whether it's a labor market or urban politics. And that is what has been a particular focus of my own work. There's a lot packed into this next slide, and I only have a few more minutes, so I'm not going to explicate it, but you can look at it if you can read it possibly as I conclude my remarks. But it tries to give the phases of U.S. urban history outlined according to some of the driving forces that organize the competition among groups. And I feel pretty comfortable with the periodization. The first column lists what cities were emerging in the era of development that we're talking about. The second column, economy, talks about what are the principal forces that were driving urbanization and urban form at that particular time. And the third and fourth columns are the ones that interest me most. The population column talks about what groups are emerging to drive the growth of urban populations. Who are the immigrants to cities, in short? And cities, especially the older ones, are built up in layers that begin at the time of its first great initial growth. And some of the layers kind of age and diminish. Sometimes they show surprising resilience. But then other layers are added on to the kind of sedimentary layers of the population mix. So if you look at New York City, you can still see Irish neighborhoods and even a few German neighborhoods that were first propelled in the mid-19th century by the Great Migration after the Irish famines and in response to the political upheavals of Germany. Throughout Brooklyn, you can see churches that on the cornerstone say Evangelische Kirche. And of course, the Irish make their presence known with big parades every March and a lot of other ways. But now they are not an ascendant group, they're a declining group. And we have, in the 1950s through the 1980s, the rise of native minority populations in a lot of big old cities, especially African Americans. That came in waves, but the biggest and most important one was in the immediate post-war World War II period for most northeastern cities. And now we have a giant wave of migration, new immigrant groups creating immigrant minorities alongside of native-born minorities. And this, to me then, urban studies and my approach to understanding cities has been all about how do these various racial and ethnic groups get mobilized? How do some of them achieve dominant political positions by creating governing majorities within cities? And what is the nature of racial and ethnic succession and competition in the evolution of these governing majorities? And the next talk that Gayle and I will give along with Arlene will focus on the current challenges to urban democracy that come out of very large numbers of new immigrants arriving in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and not just the old ones, but new ones like Charlotte and Phoenix. So thank you.
Okay. I'm Gayle Rubin from the University of Michigan, and my topic is sex in the city, or more specifically, gay sex and the industrial city. Speaking of late 19th century homosexuality, Michel Foucault once observed, quote, "As defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a morphology with an indiscrete anatomy and a mysterious physiology. The sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species," unquote. And in 1881, John Addington Symonds said of homosexuality that, quote, "This passion throbs in our large cities. The pulse of it can be felt in London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna." My remarks today address the relationship between these two observations. Homosexuality in its modern forms was significantly a product of the modern city. The growth of cities in the 19th century provided unprecedented levels of centralization, concentration, and density of population. These in turn supported all sorts of specialization, including sexual specialization. Foucault's remark captured many changes underway in the social organization of sexuality. One significant shift was the involvement of physicians in the management of sexual misconduct. What had been primarily understood as a sin was becoming a diagnosis. This medicalization was partly a result of general changes in the systems of scientific classification of groups and persons, and parallels developments in the taxonomies of race and criminals, for example. And such shifts in terminology have received a great deal of attention. I want to focus instead on the significance of the city for this process. Urban worlds enabled the formation of new sexual worlds, including gay ones. The development of new taxonomies resulted, at least in part, from the emergence of new social groups and types of persons in the cities of Western Europe, and the encounters between these populations and the doctors who gave them names and inserted them into diagnostic schema. Some of the earliest indications of this process can be found in the work of one of the earliest sexologists, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, the Austrian psychiatrist whose most famous work was Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 12 editions between 1886 and 1903. Krafft-Ebing's case studies revealed tantalizing glimpses of these urban sexual subcultures. For example, the narrator of Case 128 reported a homosexual encounter at the Opera House. He recalled that someone had told him that, quote, "male-loving men were accustomed to meet on the East Promenade," unquote. Another man reported to Krafft-Ebing that he had met more than 1,000 individuals similar to himself, and, quote, "nearly every larger town has some sort of meeting place, as well as a so-called promenade." This man also told Krafft-Ebing that the majority of people like him, quote, "do not regret their abnormality as a misfortune in any way, but would regret it if their condition could change." Krafft-Ebing's successors provided much more detailed data on urban sexual institutions. In his 1914 book on the homosexuality of men and women, German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld observed that the use of public urban space by homosexuals was in part, quote, "a result of the situation created by the persecution and prosecution of homosexuals. This happens because, in contrast to heterosexuals, homosexuals want to keep their residences as devoid as possible of sexual activity, on the one hand to preserve the secret of their names, and on the other to keep themselves free from the suspicion of neighbors with regard to their orientation. Therefore, to a much greater extent than normal people, they have to rely on places outside their homes for sexual gratification. Hirschfeld documented a staggering inventory of homosexual institutions in early 20th century Berlin. These included private clubs, political clubs, and sports clubs, including, quote, what seems to be a Berlin specialty, bowling clubs whose members are exclusively homosexual women of the working class. He observed the homosexual use of public theaters, a group of bathhouses, favored hotels, cruising areas in public parks, and even the use of personal advertisements in newspapers to find partners. He noted that certain streets were known gathering spots and that some homosexuals followed certain established routes through the city to find one another. He even mentioned individuals who, quote, own a series of city maps on which the strips preferred by homosexuals are marked with blue and red lines. He also noted that there was already a complicated system of gay bars. He said that he himself knew of, quote, 38 homosexual bars. Each of these establishments has its own special mark of distinction. This one is frequented by older people, and that one only by younger ones. Many bars, such as the Bülow Casino in Berlin and the Palmyre Bar in Paris, are frequented by homosexual ladies, and indeed Colette wrote about the Palmyre in Paris. And the significance, Hirschfeld went on to say, and the significance of these city-based institutions is shown, he notes, when, quote, many who day after day have seldom been able to remove their masks and feel here as if liberated. People have seen homosexuals from the provinces set foot in such bars for the first time and burst into violently emotional tears. Krafft-Ebing and Hirschfeld encountered the city when they were studying sex. The pioneering urban sociologist in Chicago at the Chicago School encountered sex while studying the city. One of these, of course, was Robert Park. In a 1915 essay on the city, he conceptualized a set of relationships among cities, sexual nonconformity, locational concentration, and alternative moral codes, or what would later be called deviance. He observed that, quote, the attraction of the metropolis is due in part to the fact that in the long run, every individual finds somewhere among the varied manifestations of city life the sort of environment in which he expands and feels at ease. It is, I suspect, motives of this kind which draw many, if not most, of the young men and women from the security of their homes in the country into the big, booming confusion and excitement of city life. In a small community, said Park, it is the normal man, the man without eccentricity or genius, who seems most likely to succeed. The small community often tolerates eccentricity. The city, on the contrary, rewards it. In the city, many of these divergent types now find a milieu in which, for good or ill, their dispositions and talents parturiate and bear fruit. Furthermore, Park noted that in a city, quote, the population tends to segregate itself, not merely in accordance with its interest, but in accordance with its taste or its temperaments. The resulting distribution of the population is likely to be quite different from that brought about by occupational interest or economic conditions. Every neighborhood may assume the character of what Park called a moral region. Such, for example, he said, are the vice districts, which are found in most cities. Now, vice is one of these funny terms that was used in the early 20th century to cover a multitude of sins, crimes, whatever. Mostly it referred to prostitution, but it also referred to gambling, alcohol use, drinking, criminal activity, and although it wasn't always explicit, homosexuality at that time would have been incorporated into the notion of vice. And indeed, the locational parameters of homosexuals and sex workers tend to overlap quite a bit. So I use this map, which is taken from Szymanski's book, The Immoral Landscape, to show graphically some of the geographic distribution of these activities with respect to cities. This is a map that shows the distribution of arrest for prostitution in California from 1971 to 1975. And as you can see, the major clusterings are around the major cities, also near ports and along trucking routes. If we had data on homosexual arrests for the same period of time, I suspect the map would look almost identical. And let's see the other map. Second map I have is shows some distribution within the city. This is a map of gay businesses in San Francisco around 1979. and it shows the non-random distribution of gay sites within the city and how they're clustered in certain neighborhoods. Robert Park also observed that these moral regions that he was discussing facilitated alternative standards of conduct. He said, we must then accept these moral regions as the more or less eccentric and exceptional people who inhabit them as part of the normal and natural life of the city. It is not necessary to understand by the expression moral region a place that is either criminal or abnormal. It is intended rather to apply to regions in which a divergent moral code prevails, because it is a region in which the people who inhabit it are dominated, as people are ordinarily not dominated, by a taste or a passion or some interest. It may be an art like music or a sport like horse racing. Because of the opportunity it offers, particularly to the exceptional and abnormal types, a great city tends to spread out and lay bare to the public view in a massive manner all the human characters and traits that are ordinarily obscured and suppressed in smaller communities. And I was going to read a description of a drag ball in Berlin from Hirschfeld that shows how this drag ball, which was a kind of temporary moral region, did indeed create this divergent moral code, but you can ask me about it later. In the U.S., urban gay life developed much more slowly than in Europe, partly because urbanization was a little later. The major period of the institutional proliferation of gay life began in the 1920s and peaked in the 1980s. 20th century gay life and gay institutions in the United States were heavily concentrated in the largest cities, although regional capitals and certain resorts were also magnets. But size mattered. In the late 1970s, two urban sociologists, Joseph Harry and William Duvall, wanted to figure out how large a city had to be to support a gay bar. And they concluded from their study that a minimum population of 50,000 people was necessary to support a single gay bar. Not surprisingly, larger cities had more gay bars, and they also supported more gay bar differentiation. In 1974, Joseph Harry noted, quote, those bars which are the rarest, such as black or leather bars, are almost exclusively limited to cities of over 500,000. In general, larger cities usually have a great diversity of types of gay bars, or as John Mollenkopf noted in another context, density has consequences. One last point about this map is that it represents the period of the greatest expansion of San Francisco's complex of gay institutions, the late 1970s and early 1980s. Not long after the work on which this map was based was completed, that complex began to undergo significant attrition, not because the city was shrinking, but because it was changing. And that's the topic of my next talk, the future of the gay city.
I just have a quick question for Gayle. Is that on? An exception to your rule is Provincetown, Massachusetts, so which is way on the fringe, and it's not a really big city. So how can you explain that and maybe other gay communities that thrive outside of all that urban support?
Most of them are resort. I mean, Provincetown is one of those resorts that I mentioned. Provincetown, Guerneville, Fire Island. They tend to be resort communities that have a gay presence disproportionate to their size. And there's actually a small literature on why they are. There are exceptions to the size rule. The size rule is very, very obviously applies to many places. But there are other factors, such as being on a transportation route near a port or being a resort near a big city. And Provincetown is a key example of that.
And I would say also, that points up the importance of thinking about cities not just as the major principal city in the central part of the region, which has a corporate boundary and a corporate power, but thinking of cities as city regions that include, I mean, Provincetown is a sort of far suburb of Boston and New York. Fire Island is certainly densely knitted into, the New York region and so on. It's interesting, though, that I can't think of a Bay Area equivalent. Maybe there is one.
Guerneville was.
Oh, Guerneville up on the Russian River.
And in Southern California, it's mostly Palm Springs, Palm Desert, that area.
And it's a kind of reflection of the upward mobility of the community to a degree as well.
No, I don't think so. We'd have to talk about that.
Okay.
So I have a question about the receiving of new immigrants. And it seems like the stories of at least the generations of Jews and Italians coming into New York, for example, there were particularly, public schools or magnet public schools or something like that that sort of were the transitions or the funnels into higher education. And I'm wondering, what is the state, thinking about what was the state of public schools or other important public institutions during those migrations as compared to how they are now? I mean, everyone sort of, there's a lot of discussion and debate about the poor quality of many public schools, but I'm wondering what was it actually like, and how would you compare that? Because that seems like a really key public institution for for advancement and for democratization, et cetera.
I have some thoughts about that, but Fred has spent a lot of time.
I think that's a great question, because I think that, in the United States, to use the American example, public education begins in the 1840s and 50s in Massachusetts, and there are public schools in places like New York where immigrants are coming by the 1870s, 80s, whatever. And the public schools at that time were in a very important transitional institution that were absolutely embraced by the incoming immigrant populations. Not just for the children, but there was also a vibrant system of adult education where you look at the example of Jurgis Rudkus, the hero of the jungle in Chicago, 1906. The first thing he does is look for other Lithuanians, because he only speaks Lithuanian. And he starts at the Lithuanian community, but then learns English. And this was a very important thing. I think we've lost something about that these days.
Of course, I'd like to comment on that as well, if I might. Parochial education was created by the Catholic immigrant groups as a form of resistance to the rise of public education in the form of the invention of the modern comprehensive high school starting at the end of the 19th century, and reflects a kind of struggle over what values, what orientations would be propagated in the basic educational system that would equip people to go into the labor force. Historians of education have been, I think, done a lot of interesting things about the rise of the high school and the importance of it as a kind of factory for children, or training people how to function in a modern urban economy, and equipping them with the skills that they would need to go out and be part of the modern urban labor market.
This is a part of the complexity of this whole process. When John was talking about this just now, it reminded me, my mother came to this country from Mexico City in 1917 to St. Louis, Missouri, where she went to a parochial school, and the language of instruction was German.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I can draw you out a little bit to today, where the trends toward privatization and certainly the increased technological opportunities to create community without anybody being in the same space as you, kind of redoes or at least challenges the traditional notions of the city. And I think certainly in conjunction with this notion of competition and the idea of marginalization and how communities at the periphery make their way into this kind of complex environment, the environment isn't the same for people living in the same place anymore. So I'm wondering if you could, in other words, are our traditional notions of the city at some level outdated?
I mentioned those academic conversations about where is urbanization going when we looked at that chart. But the point, at that point, it raises another question. What's a city? Because the nature of cities has indeed changed. And one of the things about cities in the age of globalization, which accompanies this recent spurt in urbanization, is that a lot of work is being done online. This is what Manuel Castells calls the space of flows, as opposed to the space of place. And people in the newest phase of urbanization are not as tied to specific places in their working life as they were before. And this makes this whole process of urbanization and accommodation to it and in-migration into urban metropolitan regions all the more complex.
But I would say these new technologies of communication and interaction and sociability are not inconsistent or not opposed to this continuing Chicago school perspective that cities create diversity and foster subcultures. And the new technologies are really just creating new ways for people to form subcultures, faster, quicker. I mean, the idea of Foursquare that you, wherever you are, you can kind of check in and see what's going on around you or where your friends are, facilitates gathering. And I would also say that Silicon Valley, to the contrary notwithstanding, the generation of the new, these new technologies is very heavily based in cities. So it's interesting to look at, you know, the change in south of Market area of San Francisco, the rise of a whole high-tech industry there, or the fact that Berlin is becoming a node for new ways of technology because a lot of young people are gathering there, and it's the cheapest capital city to live in Europe, and there's a whole sort of undiscovered tech culture that is bubbling up there, completely not the product of any, you know, city or national economic development policy. So I see these new technologies as really providing momentum to long-standing processes, not undermining them or dissipating them.
With the gay settlements, the urban settlements, actually, it's a double-edged sword, and I think that's one of the places where you see the double edge. On the one hand, yes, online communication provides unprecedented opportunities to form networks and subcultural entities very quickly, but it has actually undermined the customer base for some of the older institutions, such as the bars that used to perform these functions. So this is something I'll be talking about next time, is the collapse of a certain kind of urban set of urban gay locational institutions, partly because of the rise of online communication, but also because of high real estate prices. And it's kind of a double whammy. Unlike Berlin, San Francisco is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. So the combination of expensive real estate and the cheapness of online contact has dealt sort of a death blow to a lot of the brick and mortar institutions, kind of like bookstores and some of the other places. And the impact of that has not yet quite been assessed or calculated. For one thing, one of the reasons that San Francisco is so famous as a gay city is because it's a very tiny metropolitan area that, you know, if you took all of San Francisco and dropped it into New York, it would occupy a little piece of Midtown Manhattan. And so the voting population of San Francisco is very heavily affected by the number of gay people who have settled in what is in effect a central city of a much broader region, but the broader regions don't vote in San Francisco elections. So it has a kind of it's had over the years a kind of disproportionate impact on city politics. As those populations disperse, it will have less of an electoral impact, for example. So there are all sorts of consequences that we still don't actually quite understand how they're going to work with online, with the online world.
Okay. So my question is about opportunity and the urban poor. You mentioned the Ed Glazer argument. I haven't read his book yet, but you said it was that, if I understood you, urban poor being drawn to the cities and then largely finding opportunity. And I'm thinking in contrast, the Mike Davis book, Planet of Slums, maybe you're familiar with it, who argues that in fact slums around the world, major cities, are exploding in population. So what do you think about the relationship between opportunity and the rise of urban poor? If there are greater opportunities to be had, wouldn't we expect to see the slum populations falling rather than rising? And then as a related question, just to be a little provocative, since historically revolutions tend to begin in cities, a consequence of density, if the densities are increasing substantially, do you foresee greater upheaval and revolutions? Okay.
Two very interesting questions. I love Mike Davis. He makes me feel like I'm in 1969 again. It's terrific. But I have to say I'm more persuaded by Edward Glazer on this issue. He makes the provocative statement that, you know, there's, how's he put it? He says, there's a lot to be said for urban slums. He's that kind of writer who would you go, whoa.
He has a chapter with that title in his book.
And I think that this idea that people are moving from rural districts where they have less opportunity is very, very clear in China. The conditions in the urban centers are, in many cases, horrendous. But compared to the Chinese villages, just on the basis of life expectancy, it is definitely a step up. And one of the nice things about Saunders' book is that he gives a number of specific case studies where he talks about families with names and their day-by-day stories that show how they start to become middle class in one way or another. In any event, I think it's something to consider seriously over against Mike Davis's Planet of Slums. Take a look at A Rival City or Glazer's book. Well, the second part was about revolution. Second part about revolution, well, I don't know. I'll leave that to John, to a revolutionary here. I would just say that I do know that in the American Revolution, the urban population of the United States at the time of 1776 was, I think, 5%. And so that the vast majority of the Revolutionary Army were farmers.
Successful cities generate inequality. They're both drawing in poor people at the bottom, and they're creating wealthy elites. So cities are always far more unequal than the regions that they occupy or the countries in which they're situated. And to the extent that inequality yields conflict, class conflict, group conflict, then that's an endemic problem for cities to manage. And that's, I think, where urban politics comes in. It is also where mobility within the labor market comes in, and it's where the ethnic politics of access to better jobs comes in. If there's enough mobility, then the system will be stable. Because if you think of somebody living in a very poor part of Jamaica, moving to Brooklyn, and taking even as an undocumented worker, working on construction sites for $10 or $12 an hour, they're doing far better in Brooklyn than they would have done in Jamaica. But the census counts them as part of a swelling, low-wage, low-skilled labor force. If, to the extent that people are locked in the bottom generation after generation, then I think you build very durable class bitterness and class conflict. Historically, New York has worked, and other big cities have worked fairly well in producing intergenerational upward mobility. I think that has probably declined in the economy as a whole and also in the major cities over time for a variety of reasons that are too complicated to go into right now. So I think that, you know, underneath the seeming stability of the urban orders of the big cities of the U.S., there are some real problems brewing. One of Kathleen's colleagues at NYU has just written, I think, a very brilliant book looking at the intergenerational transmission of residents in black, poor, segregated neighborhoods, and thinking about space and the inheritance of place as a key mechanism of reproducing racial inequality in the United States. And I think the argument is very well backed up. It's very convincing to the extent that we do reproduce an excluded class in cities. It's really goes against all our democratic and American and equal opportunity values, and it constitutes a major irritant in the system, a major ongoing irritant in the system.
My question was just to go back to the category of city or urban, and I didn't hear actually at the beginning how that was defined as opposed to rural. But I'm also wondering that it's mostly been talked about as a hegemonic category, and with some
As a what category?
as an unexamined category. I'm going to change the word I used, except with the fact that with increasing density, certain things change. But just listening to John's comments, I'm wondering if the category urban, you're implying that it also changes over time. I mean, that it may mean something in one time, and for instance, if there's less class mobility, may mean something at a different time. And I'm also wondering, like, for instance, I mean, when you talk about Manhattan as being the most greenest city, I think of living in California, that Southern California, for instance, which is much more dispersed, would seem much less green. So my basic question is, when is it useful to think of urban as a kind of unified category? Or when do we have to start thinking of distinctions between one urban and another, either in terms of density or other factors? And if so, what are some of the principal factors that are useful to kind of tease out the category? Does that?
We had some slides on that, but we decided to cut them in the interest of, fitting into our 10 minutes each. And I'm sure each of us probably has different answers to that question. But density and scale certainly are two necessary ingredients to urban/city. Urban is an adjective, city is a noun. A city needs not only to have a certain density and size, but it needs a certain corporate identity. Mumford talks about the city as a container, the city as a crucible, going back to the idea of walls around cities that established its separateness from other forms of authority, and the idea of city charters granting autonomy and power to cities to handle their affairs politically. So I would say you would need not only a sort of demographic, geographic definition of scale and density, but also a kind of political institutional idea of a separate corporate identity with institutions of self-rule to some degree.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you were in a Mesopotamian city or a medieval city, it would be very clear what's the city and what's outside the walls, because these are walled cities. In a metropolitan region, a lot of people think, well, there's the city and then there's the suburbs, and that those are different things. But as John mentioned earlier, we really should be talking more now about great urban regions. If you come in from outer space and you're landing on planet Earth at night and you see the lights go up, you're probably going to think that the Bay Area is an inhabited place, something that was called a city. Not just the 49 square miles of San Francisco at the tip of one peninsula. So I think that absolutely, almost the first principle of urbanism is that things are constantly changing, even the definition of what a city is.
This is actually, is this on? This is just a follow-up really to Barbie's question. As you were talking, I was thinking about the megalopolises, the New Yorks, the Tokyos. I was also thinking about what Marc Augé calls, the French anthropologist calls non-places, places like airports and subways where people meet, but not necessarily because they have something in common other than a destination they're going to, and spaces like the internet. And I'm thinking that all of those things provide new challenges for scholars thinking about cities and thinking about sociality. And I'm wondering what the three of you find as new challenges for scholars in terms of how to study these areas. So it's a follow-on to Barbie's question, but it's more methodological. How do you get at the new phenomena of cities?
Well, I think the attack has to be at a number of different scales simultaneously with a number of different methods, and therefore it probably has to be collaborative to some degree. Ethnography gets you very intensely in a series of very specific and small spaces. sort of demographics and economics gets you looking at a larger system in which those small spaces or small worlds are embedded. Technology, especially, and capital investments in technology have always had a tremendous effect on cities. Some of them obviously promote concentration and density. The rail system. I think in other work I've discovered that density is one of the strongest predictors of democratic voting. And so therefore the Obama administration, in my view, ought to really put all its political capital behind building high-speed rail rather than doing healthcare reform, because that will reinforce all the major central cities and push our vote in a democratic direction. Other technologies, the new technologies of communication have not led to the decentralization that, just on the face of it, you think that they might. And that's because the face-to-face interactions among the people creating the technologies are a very important part of the productive process. So yes, some people can live up in Healdsburg and play the markets by having a broadband internet connection and be a successful hedge fund manager without having to be in an urban setting. But that person probably passed through a big urban setting to learn the skills, to make the connections, to know who the players are, to learn the sources of information, and so on. So even in that case, I think there's still a linkage. But, the impact of technology on urban form does raise a host of really interesting new issues. And I think there are a lot of exciting research opportunities for people just getting into the field to explore them. I mean, the very idea that you could have a database of where everyone is on a 24/7 real-time basis from their GPS locations on their phones creates a way of understanding the patterns of urban movement that were just never even conceivable up until maybe a decade ago. And I'd love to see people, it's not easy to get access to that data for proprietary reasons, but in principle it's sitting there for somebody to analyze, and I hope it happens.
I would just add that I first came to Stanford in 1973, and I started hearing about the critical importance of interdisciplinary research. I still hear that, and I still see individual departments all over the university. But urban studies is quintessentially a place where people need to do not just multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary research in that triangular citadel, market, and community diagram that John showed. There are arrows going between the two elements, and quite often, urban education, just to take one example, the problem isn't in the schools, it isn't in the home, it's in the relationship between the school and the home. And so there is an essential interdisciplinary nature to urban research that makes that promise that we've been hearing for 30 years or more about the importance of interdisciplinary work come true.
I would just say that a lot of what we do is figuring out what's similar and what's different. And there's always going to be something that's similar, something that's different. So Ruth, your question about the category of urban, it's useful to think of urban sites as something that we can talk about as a group. We also want to break them down and figure out how they're different, how the ancient cities and the medieval cities and the modern cities and the megalopolises that we're dealing with now have distinctions. And I was thinking of this in terms of the communication technologies. There's a funny little book called The Victorian Internet, and it's all about the telegraph. And we tend to think that all of these changes are somehow so new that they've never happened before, but the impact of the telegraph was probably just as significant as the impact of the internet in its time. So again, there are interesting things that are similar and interesting things that are different. And my favorite phrase these days is there's a time to lump and a time to split. And we're always engaged in that process of breaking down our categories and seeing where they don't work and what data they don't contend with. and then figuring out how comparison and similarity make sense out of stuff. So.
Thank you.